In the shadowed cathedrals of medieval Europe, where politics was blood sport and daughters were bargaining chips, a 12-year-old girl stepped into a destiny carved not by choice, but by crown. Her name was Isabella of France. To history, she would become the she-wolf. But before that, she was just a child, a terrified, seasick girl ripped from the silks of a Parisian nursery and thrown into the icy grip of English politics. At an age when most children are still learning to write their names, Isabella was signing a marriage contract that would tie her to a man twice her age, a king who barely looked at her. Edward II of England had no room in his heart for a bride, especially one sent to him as a diplomatic pawn. His affections, scandalously, belonged elsewhere, rumored to lie in the arms of his male favorite, Piers Gaveston. But none of that mattered as Isabella was loaded onto a ship, shivering not from the cold, but from the knowledge that her girlhood was over. The crossing to England was brutal, the ceremony even more so. At Westminster Abbey, she was dressed in cloth of gold that weighed almost as much as she did. Contemporary witnesses said she could barely walk down the aisle, not from nerves, but because the ceremonial garb crushed her like a funeral shroud. She didn't speak the language. She barely understood the Latin rites being spoken around her. And yet, when the golden crown was placed on her head, she did not cry. She bent, but she did not break. The bells rang for celebration. But for Isabella, it sounded more like a funeral dirge. That was the day a 12-year-old girl disappeared, and a queen was born. Not out of power, but out of necessity, out of survival. And beneath the weight of silk, gold, and obligation, Isabella began her descent into a gilded prison, a political marriage that would break her spirit, strip her identity, and ignite a flame of vengeance that would one day bring down a king. But what does it do to a girl to be used as a pawn in a game where no one expects her to survive, let alone fight back? Let's go back to the beginning. To the moment Isabella stepped off the ship, her feet touching English soil, her body trembling beneath the gold of her wedding gown, and her eyes locked on the altar where she would marry a man who never wanted her. She arrived in England under gray skies and damp winds, stepping off the ship as though walking into the jaws of fate. The English court waited with cold curiosity, whispering in a language she could barely grasp. Her name was Isabella, daughter of the formidable Philip IV of France. But here she was no longer royal blood. She was an offering. Her wedding gown awaited her in the chambers of Westminster, a monstrous creation of French silk in English ambition. Woven with threads of gold and stitched with rubies, it shimmered like a relic from a forgotten goddess. But the fabric was thick, stiff, and oppressively heavy. It didn't move with her, it restrained her. The ceremonial train trailed behind her like a shackle. Every step she took down the aisle felt less like a procession and more like a sentencing. Witnesses wrote that she needed help to stand, to walk, to breathe. But she said nothing. Her lips, pale and parted, gave no voice to the terror swelling inside. Even her tears, trained out of her in the rigid courts of France, refused to fall. The silence was part of her armor now. Beside her stood Edward II, tall, aloof, and distinctly distracted. His eyes barely met hers. He did not smile. He did not reach for her hand. Instead, his gaze often drifted across the room toward Piers Gaveston, his companion, his favorite, his shadow. The court knew. France knew. Even the child bride standing at the altar knew. The Latin vows were a blur. Words meant to bind them together rang hollow. Isabella didn't understand half of what was spoken, but she understood the weight of it. When the golden crown was lowered onto her head, it pressed down with almost comical severity, tilting her young neck until she had to strain just to hold it upright. This wasn't a wedding, it was a transformation ritual, a child's funeral and a queen's coronation, wrapped into one. The ceremony dragged for 4 hours. 4 hours of standing, nodding, kneeling, rising, and being watched. It was not about union, it was about politics. Two kingdoms eyeing each other warily, both hedging their bets on a girl's fertility and a man's loyalty. When it ended, London's bells rang in jubilation. But inside Westminster Abbey, a different sound echoed louder. Silence, the kind that follows submission. The feast that followed should have been her celebration. Instead, it became her introduction to humiliation. Seated beside Edward, who still barely acknowledged her presence, Isabella tried to maintain royal composure as nobles laughed in tongues she couldn't follow, clinked glasses to toasts she didn't understand, and whispered about the king's peculiar affections. And then came the moment that would etch itself into her memory like a scar. Piers Gaveston entered the hall adorned in her coronation jewels. The ruby necklace, custom made for her debut as queen, now hung around his neck. Rings meant for her slender fingers glinted on his. The gift of a crown, stolen by the king's lover. The court laughed politely. Isabella didn't. What kind of man gifts his bride's crown jewels to his male lover on their wedding night, while she sits beside them, trying not to cry? And more terrifying, what kind of queen lets it happen and lives long enough to take her revenge? The wedding night, mercifully brief, was yet another performance. No chambermaid's tale of passion, no romantic consummation, just protocol, followed through with the same mechanical coldness as the vows before it. By morning, her French maids had been dismissed. Her belongings from childhood, her dolls, her favorite tapestry, her writing quills, gone. In their place stood unfamiliar servants who bowed stiffly but did not speak her language, and rules she had yet to memorize but already feared breaking. She was now expected to produce heirs despite still being a child herself. Her body was considered public property, examined, managed, and measured for the needs of empire. Her meals were served with ceremonial grandeur, yet every bite felt scrutinized. Every word spoken was monitored, every gesture judged. Even walking became a form of theater. When she strolled the gardens, she was watched. When she prayed in chapel, she was observed. She learned quickly that silence was not safety. It was a vacuum others rushed to fill with assumptions and intrigue. And still, she said nothing. But she was watching, recording, memorizing. The weight of the crown on her head never truly lifted. Its pressure transformed into something deeper, internal. The burden of a child forced to become an empress, stripped of autonomy, and left to navigate a court where affection was transactional, loyalty temporary, and betrayal inevitable. Isabella's queenship had begun not in love, not even in politics, but in silence, humiliation, and isolation. And in that silence, something ancient began to stir. Something sharp, something patient, something that waits, something that would one day, decades later, earn her the name She-Wolf. The crown may have rested on her head, but Isabella held no keys to her own life. In the days following her wedding, the reality of her new identity settled around her not like velvet, but like chains. Her chambers in Westminster Palace were majestic. Vaulted ceilings, stained glass casting rainbows over silk tapestries, gold-trimmed furniture carved in the French style. But behind every luxury, a surveillance system lurked. Every mirror had eyes. Every door had a lock. On the outside, her correspondence was monitored. Every letter to her family was opened, translated, and dissected by English officials before ever reaching French soil, if it reached at all. And any reply she received was so heavily redacted it read like a ransom note. She learned to write in riddles, to hide feelings between the lines, to lace loyalty in polite silence. Her household, once filled with loyal French attendants, had been purged. In their place were English ladies-in-waiting, noble women loyal not to their queen but to her king. Most acted as informants, reporting on her conversations, her moods, even her dreams. She was never truly alone. Even in the chapel when kneeling in prayer, she could feel the eyes of others. When she walked the gardens, it was only under escort. When she sat for meals, the food had been chosen not for comfort, but for symbolism. Nothing French, no reminders of home. Reading was permitted, but only texts deemed appropriate. Scripture, court etiquette, genealogy of English nobles. Music was allowed, but songs that reminded her of her childhood were quietly banned. Her voice, once clear, clever, and sharp, grew quiet. Her laughter vanished. This was not marriage, this was reprogramming. Edward's presence in her life was as intermittent as it was disheartening. When he did acknowledge her, it was through formality, dinners, processions, ceremonies, moments staged for the court. In private, he was absent, distant, sometimes even cruel. He referred to her through others. There were times they'd spend entire weeks in the same palace without exchanging a single word directly. But the absence of affection was only part of her suffering. The true torment lay in humiliation. The king's favoritism for Piers Gaveston wasn't just whispered, it was shouted in protocol. At royal audiences, Gaveston sat where Isabella should have. He received gifts meant for her. He even dressed in her colors. Ambassadors were told to greet him before the queen. And behind closed doors, Edward lavished his lover with affection, while Isabella was left cold, untouched, and publicly dismissed. Contemporary chronicles called Gaveston beautiful and wicked, a man whose wit was matched only by his cruelty. To Isabella, he was a tormentor in velvet gloves. He mocked her accent, her clothing, her inability to command her husband's attention. He called her the French whore, not even in whispers. The coronation banquet should have been her night, her triumph. Instead, it became the scene of one of the most devastating insults of her life. Gaveston arrived wearing the ruby necklace crafted specifically for Isabella, the centerpiece of her coronation regalia, snatched from her private treasury by Edward and gifted to his favorite. She said nothing. She did nothing. But that silence wasn't surrender. It was the beginning of something deeper. That night, a servant reported finding Isabella standing motionless at the window long after the banquet ended. Still in full regalia, her fingers white-knuckled around the edge of the windowsill. "I saw a queen," the servant said, but it was the eyes of a wolf looking back at the dark. Isabella began to change. She became quieter but more calculating. She stopped trying to please. She observed, memorized. Every insult was stored, every slight recorded. She began to understand how power moved, not through emotion, not even through lineage, but through loyalty, manipulation, and leverage. And yet, she was still a child. At 12, she was expected to carry herself like a woman. At 13, to prepare for motherhood. At 14, to be examined for signs of maturity. Court physicians, always male, always cruel, prodded and measured her like livestock. Her virginity was not a matter of privacy. It was a political issue, tracked like a treaty clause. The marriage was not consummated until she was deemed fit. Until then, she lived in limbo. Neither child nor wife, neither French nor English, not royal but not free. To the court, she was a vessel, waiting to be filled with heirs. Her worth was not in her thoughts, but in her womb. Every month she failed to conceive, whispers grew louder. Every failed attempt brought new regimens, herbal brews, bizarre rituals, forced diets. And yet, Isabella endured, not gracefully, but ferociously. She began leaving subtle marks on the world around her, her initials carved beneath a chapel bench, a French flower embroidered into her gowns, secret notes passed to sympathetic servants. She could not fight the cage, but she could leave messages in the cracks. Her identity, so ruthlessly dismantled, began to reconstruct itself from fragments. She wasn't just the daughter of Philip IV. She wasn't just the wife of Edward II. She was becoming someone new. A woman forged not by destiny, but by defiance. By the time she turned 15, she no longer flinched when Gaveston entered the room. By 16, she no longer tried to write letters to her family. By 17, she had learned to walk silently across the palace stones, her footsteps making no sound, but her presence impossible to ignore. The weight of the crown never lessened, but she had stopped trying to remove it. Instead, she learned how to carry it without letting it break her spine. She would become the Queen England feared, not because she demanded it, but because she had survived what should have destroyed her. The girl who once trembled beneath a crown now moved like shadow and fire, silent but always watching. By the time Isabella reached her mid-20s, she had become a different creature entirely. Not yet the she-wolf, but something more dangerous, a queen who had learned patience. But even patience has a breaking point. That point came with the rise of Hugh Despenser the Younger. If Gaveston had humiliated her, Despenser annihilated her autonomy. Where Gaveston flaunted his favoritism, Despenser weaponized it. He didn't just steal the king's affections, he stole the machinery of government. Appointments, titles, even military commands were funneled through him. Edward II, always pliable, now existed more as Despenser's mouthpiece than as monarch. And Isabella? She was reduced to ceremonial silence. Despenser began a slow and deliberate purge of her allies. Any noble who showed her sympathy was exiled, arrested, or accused of treason. Her French advisors, gone. Her supporters, scattered. Her own estates, seized. The Queen of England now had no income, no household, no political voice, and soon, no freedom of movement. Despenser turned the palace into a labyrinth of informants and invisible walls. Isabella was watched, restricted, and punished for even attempting to write to her family. Every meal, every visitor, every whisper was filtered through his hands. Even her clothing was regulated. The queen, who had once been dressed in Parisian grandeur, now wore what the Despensers allowed: conservative, plain, and silenced in silk. But Despenser made one fatal mistake. He assumed a caged lioness had forgotten how to hunt. In 1325, the perfect opportunity arose. France and England were locked in another territorial dispute. Gascony was slipping from English control. The king needed a trusted emissary to negotiate peace with her brother, King Charles IV of France. Isabella saw her chance. With flawless composure, she offered herself. She reminded Edward of her bloodline, her loyalty, her ability to calm tensions. She spoke of duty, of sacrifice, of maternal love, how it would pain her to leave her children. Edward hesitated, Despenser objected. But in the end, Isabella's mask of obedience convinced them both, and so she departed. Her entourage was handpicked by Despenser, her letters of instruction drafted by Edward, her mission supervised by spies. But the moment she set foot in Paris, something shifted. After 17 years under England's thumb, she was free. Her voice returned, her posture changed. The haunted look in her eyes cleared like storm clouds breaking after a decade of rain. The French court welcomed her, not just as a sister and queen, but as a political force. Diplomacy quickly gave way to planning, secret meetings, whispered alliances. And then came him, Roger Mortimer, exiled English baron, escaped from the Tower of London, fierce, calculating, dangerous. Everything Edward II was not. Mortimer was the missing piece. Where Isabella had royal blood, Mortimer had military experience. Where she had the crown, he had the sword. And together they shared something rarer than power. Vengeance. Their alliance began as strategy, but the chemistry was undeniable. In private letters, Isabella referred to him not just as partner, but as my beloved. And in him, she found what no man in her life had offered: respect. Together, they built an army. Isabella secured financing through French nobles and Flemish merchants. Mortimer coordinated mercenary forces from Germany and Hainaut. Messages were smuggled across the Channel. English lords, long resentful of Despenser's tyranny, began to pledge quiet support. And all the while, Isabella never wavered in her performance. She sent diplomatic letters to Edward. She praised his leadership. She requested more time to negotiate. She lamented the distance from her son. But her real work was done in coded meetings, sealed pacts, and whispered promises. In one intercepted letter, Despenser's spies found a phrase that chilled the English court. The lion sleeps tonight, but the wolf has left the woods. By September 1326, Isabella and Mortimer set sail for England with a modest force of 1,500 men. But they didn't come to plead. They came to conquer. They landed in Suffolk. Within days, nobles and commoners alike flocked to their banner. Despenser had spent a decade ruling through fear, but Isabella inspired fury. The tide turned so swiftly it stunned the monarchy. Edward fled west with Despenser, leaving London to Isabella without a fight. The capital welcomed her with open arms. Church bells rang for the queen, not for mercy, but for retribution. She pursued them across the country, moving like a commander born for the battlefield. And when Despenser was finally captured, dragged from his hiding place, she didn't flinch. His trial was swift, the sentence brutal: hanged, drawn, and quartered. Isabella watched every second. There would be no forgiveness, not this time. The she-wolf had returned, not as a queen beside a king, but as a storm that tore the crown from his head. As Despenser's mutilated body was paraded before the people, his entrails burned, his limbs sent to the four corners of the kingdom, Isabella stood unmoved. The cheers of the crowd echoed through the November air, but her silence was thunderous. Justice had been delivered, but retribution was not yet complete. Edward II still breathed. The man who had ignored her, humiliated her, imprisoned her. The king who had given away her jewels, her freedom, her dignity. He had been chased from his throne like a criminal, abandoned by nobles, deserted by allies. But to leave him alive was to leave a spark in the ashes. Isabella knew, if he lived, he could return. He was captured shortly after Despenser's execution, cold, exhausted, and clinging to the rags of kingship in a monastery in South Wales. He did not fight, he barely spoke. The once defiant monarch had crumbled into a shadow, hollow-eyed and worn thin by fear. He was brought before Isabella. No throne between them now, no crown, no pomp, just a fallen king and a woman who had once knelt beside him in silence, now standing tall above him in command. The decision was swift. Edward was forced to abdicate. His son, her son, would become Edward III, aged only 14. Isabella and Mortimer would rule as regents until the boy came of age. In a carefully choreographed ceremony at Kenilworth Castle in January 1327, Edward signed the Articles of Abdication. Witnesses noted how his hand trembled, how his voice cracked, how he looked to Isabella with a flicker of hope. She gave him nothing in return. The crown he had worn like a toy was now placed on his child's brow, heavy, cold, and full of consequence. The same weight that had once bent Isabella's own neck now bowed her son's. And Edward II, he was taken away. His place of imprisonment was Berkeley Castle. Stone walls, thick gates, endless isolation. He was held incommunicado. No letters, no visits, no hope. His captors claimed he was treated according to his station, but whispers from the shadows told a different tale. Some said he was tortured. Others said he went mad. All agreed on one thing: he would never leave Berkeley alive. One night in September 1327, muffled screams were heard echoing through the stone corridors of the castle. Days later, a corpse was presented, pale, mutilated, silent forever. Official cause of death, natural causes. But no one believed that. Rumors spread like wildfire, that he had been suffocated, that he had been strangled, that a red-hot poker had been inserted into his body to leave no visible wounds, that Isabella had ordered it, that Mortimer had watched. There was no trial, no confession, no justice. There was only a dead king and a kingdom too afraid to ask questions. Isabella never spoke of it. She wore black for a respectable period, attended mass, prayed for his soul, but her face betrayed nothing. Her silence, again, was its own kind of verdict. Edward III was now king in name, but Isabella and Mortimer held the reins. Together they ruled with confidence, calculation, and theatrical flair. They ended the war with Scotland, reorganized royal finances, repaired alliances. But behind the scenes, the balance shifted. Isabella, once the face of noble rebellion, now carried the stench of unchecked power. Her enemies whispered, her former allies grew wary. The lavish lifestyle she and Mortimer enjoyed, the jewels, the banquets, the processions, began to sour in the eyes of the court. And Edward III, he was growing older, wiser, watching. He remembered how his father had been humiliated, how his mother had risen in blood. He remembered the screams no one dared speak of. And most of all, he waited. By October 1330, he was 18, no longer a boy king, but a man. And in the dead of night at Nottingham Castle, he struck. With a small band of loyal knights, he stormed the royal apartments. Mortimer was seized. Isabella, awakened in her bed, stood face to face with her son. She begged for Mortimer's life. She pleaded. She reminded him of everything she had done. For him. Because of him. But Edward's expression was as still and cold as the stones of the fortress around them. Mortimer was tried for treason, found guilty, hanged at Tyburn like a common criminal. His body left to rot. Isabella was spared, out of respect, out of calculation, out of mercy. But her reign was over. The woman who had once commanded armies and dethroned a king now found herself under quiet guard. Far from court, far from politics, far from power. Castle Rising in Norfolk was no dungeon, but it was no palace either. It was a retirement home for a queen who had tasted absolute authority and had it ripped from her by her own son. Edward III spared her life, but not her influence. He had seen too much, heard too much. Perhaps he had always known what she was capable of and feared what she might do again. And so Isabella of France, the she-wolf, faded from view. She was granted a generous pension. Her quarters were richly furnished. She received visits from clerics, from nobles, from women of rank, but all under careful watch. Every privilege came with conditions. Every gesture of kindness doubled as surveillance. Her days became routine: mass in the morning, letters in the afternoon, embroidery, gardens, and prayer. Gone were the velvet banners of rebellion, the whispers of treason, the silken thrill of risk. Her court had shrunk to a few attendants. Her stage was now a single stone manor. But time had not dulled her intelligence. She remained a queen in bearing, spoke little, listened much. She wrote letters, many of which survive, revealing a mind still sharp, still strategic. She signed them Isabella, by the grace of God, Queen of England, a title no one had dared strip from her even in disgrace. She entertained occasional visits from Edward III. These were polite, formal, and brief. They spoke not of Mortimer, not of Despenser, not of Edward II, and never of Berkeley Castle. But sometimes, when court festivities called for grandeur, Isabella was summoned, draped in jewels, seated beside her son, a living symbol of royal endurance. She played her role as mother, as relic, as monarch emeritus. And then she returned to her quiet exile. At one of these court ceremonies, Isabella wore her wedding dress, restored, repaired, rethreaded with gold. The same gown she had worn at 12, the day she became a queen. Some said she smiled, others said she wept, but no one asked why. She lived nearly 30 years after her fall from power. She outlived Mortimer. She outlived most of her enemies. She even outlived the rumors, though not entirely. Whispers still clung to her legacy like cobwebs in a cathedral, that she had ordered her husband's murder, that she had kept Mortimer's heart in a casket near her bed, that she had never truly stopped ruling, even from the shadows. But these were stories told in hushed tones across candlelight. In truth, Isabella had become a ghost of her own myth, present but elusive. Her final years were marked by religious devotion and charitable works. She funded almshouses, donated to convents, sponsored masses for the souls of the dead, including notably Edward II. Whether this was guilt, calculation, or spiritual insurance, no one knows. She died in 1358 at the age of 63, a quiet death surrounded not by fanfare, but by the dull hush of inevitability. Her funeral was dignified but unremarkable. She was buried in London at Greyfriars Church, not far from the power centers she had once ruled. According to legend, she was interred in that same wedding gown, its golden threads now faded with age. And some say, nestled against her heart, was the relic of a man she had once loved and lost to the gallows. Isabella's reign as regent had lasted only 3 years. Her true time in power, fleeting. And yet, centuries later, her name still echoes, an enigma tangled in thrones, betrayal, and survival. She was never just one thing, not merely a victim, not merely a villain, not merely a mother, not merely a queen. She was a woman who had been handed a poisoned chalice at 12, drank it, and learned to wield it as a weapon. She had outlived her abusers, outmaneuvered her enemies, but she had also outlived her glory. History has never quite decided what to do with Isabella of France. Some chronicles paint her in blood, others veil her in mourning, but none can look away. Her name is a riddle that has outlived kings, kingdoms, and cathedrals. A woman too dangerous for her time, too visible to forget, too powerful to forgive. In the centuries since her death, Isabella's image has twisted like candlelight on old stone walls, shifting from wicked to tragic to heroic, depending on who holds the pen. To some, she remains the she-wolf, a calculating seductress, a femme fatale who bedded a traitor and murdered her husband to crown her lover. A monster cloaked in ermine and steel. They see Mortimer's execution not as justice, but as the price of ambition gone too far. Her regency, they say, was an era of greed, revenge, and overreach. They point to the rumors, her cold composure at Despenser's torture, the whispered details of Edward II's death, the speculation that she kept Mortimer's embalmed heart near her bed for years. To these storytellers, Isabella is less queen and more cautionary tale. A woman who reached for too much and paid the price. But others see something different. They see a girl, 12 years old, forced into marriage with a man who despised her. A child stripped of country, language, protection. A pawn in a brutal game who learned to play it better than her captors. They see her not as monstrous, but as a survivor who used the only weapons left to her: silence, patience, and strategy. They remember the years she spent under surveillance, isolated, humiliated, betrayed. And they argue, when you trap a girl in a cage for long enough, you cannot be surprised when she breaks the bars and bites. What if Isabella wasn't a villain at all, but a mirror, a reflection of the system that built her, used her, and feared her once she learned its rules? Isabella's life throws the entire machinery of medieval monarchy into sharp, cruel relief. Her marriage was not love, it was policy. Her body not her own, it was a vessel for heirs. Her value was calculated not in virtues, but in land, alliances, and bloodlines. Every stage of her life was choreographed by men who never asked what she wanted, only what she was worth. She was crowned without choice, married without consent, exiled without trial. And yet, when she finally acted, when she chose to rebel, she was condemned not for her methods, but for daring to have any at all. The same court that once silenced her accused her of being too loud. The same king who ignored her begged her for mercy. Isabella exposed a deeper truth, one that still echoes centuries later. That power held by a woman is never neutral. It is always suspect, always dangerous, always unnatural, until history needs her to clean up a mess or produce a dynasty. Even the label she-wolf, intended as an insult, holds unintended truth. Wolves are not mindless killers. They are strategic, hierarchical, loyal, and lethal when cornered. They protect their young. They mourn their dead. They remember, so did Isabella. Her legacy, then, is not just a scandal, it's a lens. Through her, we see the contradictions of monarchy, the brutality masked by ceremony, the cages disguised as castles, the way systems reward submission and punish survival. She was both victim and architect. She endured, then retaliated. She lost everything, then rebuilt in silence. And when the crown no longer rested on her head, she wore it in memory, etched into her spine, carved into her silence. When Isabella of France died in 1358, she left behind no final speech, no confession, no memoir, only a story that refuses to stay buried, a tale stitched from silk and blood, gold and shadow, betrayal and boldness, a child bride who became a ghost in royal corridors, a forgotten queen who reshaped England and was nearly erased from it. Isabella of France was never given the luxury of being ordinary. From the moment she was sent across a storm-torn sea at 12, to the day she stood over the broken body of her husband's favorite, to the long silence of her final years, she lived at the sharpest edge of power. A queen without a voice who learned to whisper in strategy, to speak in rebellion, and to roar when the world least expected. She was called a monster, a martyr, a she-wolf. But maybe she was something else entirely. Maybe Isabella wasn't the villain history painted, but the price paid when a system that devours its daughters finally meets one who bites back. She played the game, and for a time she won. But in the end, her story is not just one of vengeance, it's one of survival. Of a woman who was never allowed to want, yet dared to take, who was taught to kneel, yet chose to rise. And now we have to ask, have we misunderstood her all along? Was Isabella a warning or a mirror? What does her story say about how we treat women in power, even now? We want to hear from you. Was Isabella of France a tragic icon, a ruthless rebel, or simply human, flawed, brilliant, and forced to fight in a world built to break her? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Suggest the next historical icon we should unravel. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this, where history isn't just dates and crowns, but drama, fire, and defiance. Because sometimes, the past doesn't stay buried. It haunts, it howls, and it reminds us. Even in silence, some queens never stop speaking.